Critical Mountain Pictures presents the Forex Video Training Series, Black Belt, Second Degree, Trade Guide to Major Economies, New Zealand. If you've seen The Lord of the Rings, then you probably know that Middle-earth is located somewhere along the hills of New Zealand. More than being home to Frodo Baggins and his hobbit friends, New Zealand is also one of Australia's next-door neighbours in Oceania, the southern region of the Pacific Ocean. The country is made up of two main islands, the North and South Islands, and several smaller islands. Famous hosting a larger population of sheep than people, New Zealand is home to about 4 million residents. To put that into perspective, New York alone had a population of 8.4 million people in 2009. New Zealand is also known as Aotearoa, which means land of the long white cloud in Maori, one of the major languages of the country. Some of the facts and figures of New Zealand. With its teeny tiny population, New Zealand's economy is also relatively small. Its GDP, which is valued at 182 billion New Zealand dollars in 2009, ranks 60th among the world economies. But don't underestimate New Zealand. The country makes up for size by being a strong player in trade. Their economic activity is largely dependent on trade, mostly with the land down under, Australia, the land of the rising sun, Japan, and Uncle Sam, the U.S. It is an export-driven economy, with its main exports such as ores, metals, and wool comprising a third of its GDP. It also exports much of its cattle and dairy products. Angus beef sound familiar to you? Its primary industries are agricultural and tourism, and they only have small manufacturing and technology sectors. Because of that, its imports from other countries comprise mostly of heavy machinery, equipment, vehicles, and electronic products. Since the country has removed many barriers to foreign investment, the World Bank has praised New Zealand for being one of the most business-friendly countries in the world, second to Singapore. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand, RBNZ, is in charge of the monetary and fiscal policy of the nation. Currently headed by Governor Alan Bollard, the RBNZ holds monetary policy meetings 8 times a year. The RBNZ is tasked with maintaining price stability, setting interest rates, and monitoring output and exchange rates. To achieve price stability, the RBNZ must ensure that annual inflation meets the 1.5% central bank target. Otherwise, the government has the right to kick the RBNZ governor out of office. We're not kidding either. The RBNZ has the following tool in its monetary price arsenal. The official cash rate, OCR, which affects short-term interest rates, is set by the RBNZ governor. By lending 25 basis points above this rate and borrowing 25% below this rate to commercial banks, the central bank is able to control the interest rate offered to individuals and businesses. Open market operations are used to meet cash target or amount of reserves parked in commercial banks. By forecasting the cash target daily, the RBNZ is able to calculate how much money to inject into the economy in order to meet the target. Getting to know the New Zealand dollar. The nickname is the Kiwi. It's a bird. It's a plane. No, wait, it's really a bird. The Kiwi also happens to be the national symbol for New Zealand, but let's focus on the Kiwi and as a currency and its interesting characteristics. Since New Zealand's economy is mostly dependent on its export of commodities and agricultural products, the overall economic performance of the region is linked to commodity prices. If commodity prices rise, then the amount of money paid for New Zealand's exports also rises, which then makes a larger contribution to the country's GDP. Since a higher GDP reflects a strong economic performance, it could lead to an appreciation of the Kiwi. Conversely, falling commodity prices result in lower monetary value of exports, making a smaller contribution to GDP. A lower GDP could then cause the Kiwi to depreciate. Since Australia is New Zealand's #1 trade partner, the economic performance of Australia has a huge impact on New Zealand. For instance, when the Australian economy does well, Australian firms pump up their importing activities, and guess who benefits from that? New Zealand, of course. Just like Australia, New Zealand enjoys higher interest rates compared to other major economies such as the US, UK, or Japan. Interest rate differentials between economies often serve as indicators of money flows. Since investors prefer to receive higher returns, they'll sell lower-yielding investments in exchange for higher-yielding assets or currencies. In other words, the higher the interest rate, the more money flows in. Because New Zealand's population is less than half the number of people living in New York, an increase in migration in the country has a huge effect on the economy. This is because as population growth, the demand for goods and overall consumption increases. New Zealand's economy is also largely driven by agricultural industry, which means that severe weather conditions such as droughts have a huge negative impact on their economy. Those heat waves are also prevalent in Australia, which is more frequented by forest fires, costing close to 1% of its GDP in damages. This does not do the New Zealand dollar any good. Some economic indicators. Gross domestic product. Just like any other nation, the gross domestic product, or GDP, serves as an economic report card for New Zealand. By serving as a gauge of the overall economic performance for New Zealand, it influences the demand for the New Zealand dollars. Consumer Price Index, or CPI. The Consumer Price Index measures the change in price levels. As a measure of inflation, it is closely watched by the RBNZ in determining changes in monetary policy. They're supposed to maintain price stability, remember? The balance of trade. Since New Zealand is an export-driven economy, traders often take a look at their trade balance to gauge international demand for New Zealand's products. What moves the New Zealand dollar? Positive GDP growth reflects the strong economic standing of New Zealand, boosting demand for its currency. Negative GDP growth highlights the poor economic performance of the country, dampening demand for NZD. Higher demand for New Zealand's products often result in a higher GDP, which then boosts the New Zealand dollar. In contrast, lower exports make a smaller contribution to GDP, causing the New Zealand dollar to fall. Increasing commodity prices cause the monetary value of New Zealand's exports to rise, pushing its GDP higher. Falling commodity prices, on the other hand, cause the monetary value of its exports to fall, dragging the GDP down. The trade tactics. Strong economic reports from New Zealand result to an appreciation of the New Zealand dollar, so if there's a good chance that economic release could beat the consensus, it could be a sign to go long on the New Zealand dollar US dollar. Weak economic reports, on the other hand, push the NZD down. If an upcoming report is likely to come in weaker than anticipated, it could be a chance to short the New Zealand dollar US dollar. Aside from watching economic reports, take note of commodity price behavior, but also serve to be trade signals for the New Zealand dollar US dollar. Most of the time, commodity prices surge when demand for risk assets is strong. During these times, investors place their money in higher-yielding assets such as gold or other commodities and sell the lower-yielding US dollar. As a result, the commodity-based Kiwi gains strongly against the safe haven US dollar. On the other hand, when risk aversion forces investors to flee back to safe havens, New Zealand dollar edges lower against the US dollar. Just like the Australian dollar, the New Zealand dollar is a good candidate for a carry trade, since carry trades involve buying of a currency with a high interest rate and selling that of a currency of a low interest rate. New Zealand's relatively high interest rates provide support for NZT carry trades.